All right. Well, welcome everybody to our first Ask Me Anything. This is sponsored by Reveal. My name is Chris Lee, and I have the title of Executive Director or Chief Gopher, whichever you prefer. I've been out for about 29 years now, as of this week, I guess, and I've been an activist for about maybe 6 months less than that, so 28 and a half years. And happy to have you all, and we have a number of questions that you've submitted. Hopefully we'll get to all of them, and then if there are any ones that you'd like to throw out there and have them answered anyways, we'll try to get to them as well. We'll hopefully have plenty of time to spare, and we'll call this off in about an hour and 3/4. Anyways, I'll pass this to Michael.
Hello, I'm Michael Potts. I was in the ICOC from 1998 to 2006. I've been out for 14 years. They converted me to triangle. I got an interesting story. They got me a triangle, and then went up to Dayton to finish my degree, and then I finished it out in Cincinnati. And that's where me and my family live today, beautiful Cincinnati. So excited for this. Let's do this.
All right, Joe and Janice also on the panel.
Hi, guys. I was in the ICOC. We're Joe and Janice Franklin. I was in the ICOC from 1988 to 2003. Janice?
I joined the group in 1985 when it was still the Mission Church of Christ. It was the Crossroads Church back then.
In San Diego.
In San Diego. Sorry, yes, this was in San Diego. And then I left about 3 years later, and I left right after the Reconstruction. So I went through the Reconstruction, didn't get through the Reconstruction, left for about 3 years, or I left after 3 years, excuse me, was gone for about 4 years, came back when it was the International Church of Christ, or San Diego Church of Christ, and stayed for about another 10 years. I met Joe there. We married in the church, and we left together shortly after the Henry Crete letter in 2003. And we have our own ministry, our website, sparrowministry.com. That you might want to check out. Joe has written several ebooks about the group. I'm sure he'll want to talk about that at some point.
Great, thanks for the introduction. And we'll just jump right into the questions, I guess, that we have. And I'm sure, so burning on a lot of people's minds is the whole question about the lawsuits. And outside of what's already been given in terms of public record, we can't really say too much. Can certainly say that the first one is two separate pieces of litigation in terms of unreported sexual crimes to minors. And over the next couple of weeks, Bobby Samini is already...
You guys have the cats, right?
Sorry. So anyways, there will be upcoming lawsuits in terms of unreported crimes to adults, and that is in the works. I know Justine isn't here, so I'm sure she can probably correct if I have misspoken. And I know that there's upwards of 100 people who have spoken to Shell and Justine, and it's very widespread. It's a pretty sobering situation with all these victims, and it's very sad. So
let's see. I'm going to read those two.
I'm going to mute some people here. Anyways, all right. So then, but yes, some people are kind of curious about the situation right now and how churches are responding to it. And it seems like they're addressing it in their own way. It is probably the best way that I can put it. So they have said some things like, oh, these things have happened in the past. Some of them said many years in the past, which we know this is not the case. And some of them have also said, yeah, there's plenty of protocols in place to filter out, such sexual predators. But again, if they are dismissing staff members as of even 2 calendar years ago, even in Los Angeles, And finally, marking, not only disfellowshipping, but marking such a man 2 months ago. This is not a long time in the past.
One comment. I wish I could figure out how to do this. No, let's see.
Sorry about that. I'm not sure what the background noise is.
Yes.
Anyways, all right. So can't really say much more. Certainly the RICO has been invoked for separate reasons, or several reasons. One is that they are using church monies to relocate certain leaders and perpetrators, and also that there have been, irregularities at best. Certainly there's been extortion and coercion, as Golden Run has exposed and others have exposed. So there's a lot of concerns there. But we'll move on from there. So in terms of questions that are submitted, maybe we'll jump to, it's now 20 years since the Henry Creed letter. In fact, it'll be like 20 years to February. And maybe some of you have suggested questions like, okay, what has changed? My friends are inviting me back to church. They say everything has changed, or things are on the up and up, things are better. What has the church learned since 2002? So anyways, anybody want to take it there? Maybe either Michael or Joe and Janice.
Well, let's see. How has the ICOC changed since 2003? So I think a lot of people are kind of know, even if you're from the ICOC or have joined past 2003, or you're on the ICC side, and this is kind of halfway new, you weren't there, and one of the reasons your group was created. Ultimately, they haven't, everything laid down in the Henry Creed letter where the impetus was, okay, we've been caught in sin, we're corrupt, and we need to change, otherwise this is going to continue. The thing is, nothing really has changed. Fundamentally, they still preach the same gospel that they did before, that you have to accept their discipling system to become saved, and you have to continue following their discipling system in order to remain saved. And that kind of propagates down to everything else. We know the levels of discipling in the ICC mimic what was going on in the ICOC. It was a strict pyramid. You have Kip McKean at the top, kind of discipling his new world sector leaders who are discipling their people into there, all the way down to the bottom. In the ICOC, it's a little bit more loose. There's no one person at the top. There appear to be groups of leaders at the top. They kind of reorganized everything to kind of have representatives from individual churches kind of go into these upper committees or upper level groups. So technically, if you want to put a label on it, it's kind of more like a Presbyterian synod to a degree. So these aren't individual churches that are all kind of working together and governed independently, strictly per se, but they are kind of I don't know, Chris has a nice little diagram popped up here. So you see up here, you've got the official overarching governing body. You can look at that URL, ICOC co-op with the dash in the middle there, .org. So you've got these catalyst teams with teachers, elders, women's ministry leaders, kind of chairs. And so the catalyst team is kind of the top committee, kind of running everything. And then you've got service teams coming off of that to kind of handle certain things like the National Campus Ministry Conference, kind of typical ministries that we have, ICOC Church, Hope Worldwide. So like I said a couple of seconds ago, you've got the delegates kind of at the top. And this is something that we haven't...
Huh? I'm gonna call it. Why?
We put some people on mute here.
Embarrassing.
Okay, thanks. So and this is something we're kind of discovering kind of piecemeal fashion. So for me being here in Cincinnati, kind of occasionally listen to some of the videos and some of the sermons and stuff like that. So apparently the evangelist in Cincinnati, Sean Kirkland, he is one of the delegates. And there's video where he says that he and his wife are the shepherding couple for all the ICOC churches in the Ohio Valley region, which is kind of all the churches in Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia. And then he said he's starting to be discipled by Walter Evans, who is currently the Elder Service Team Chair, and he's in Philadelphia. So a long time ago, the original ICOC and the world sectors, they were part of a group called the ACR, the American Commonwealth Region. And so it's kind of pretty much the same group today, pretty much. So there's not a super duper strict hierarchy, but there is apparently centers of power, and you've got people, kind of groups kind of influencing one another. And at the bottom, you've got all 750 or so individual congregations with some people. Some of those churches have balanced boards. Some of them are just led by evangelists or group of evangelists like the ICOC was back before 2003. Kind of surprisingly, you've got many churches without elders. I've heard you've got this shepherding couples. I know they had shepherding couples back in the day. So it's kind of like elders in training. They're not officially elders, but they're not. So it's kind of like you're elders, but you're not elders. It's pseudo elder. Then when you become a real elder, do you have the same amount of power that kind of balanced with the evangelist? So it's kind of messy, especially with those of us, in normal churches today where we have, or at least in a lot of cases, you have a group of elders who are the pastors who actually do the preaching and teaching, and then you have deacons who take care of the physical needs, stuff like that. So, so this is where things are at right now in terms of church polity and structure. Let me see. One of the questions we have on here: how come my friends are returning to church? They told me the church has changed for the good. Have they? Because we're still receiving cases of people who have been spiritually abused, who join and get kicked out. Same thing as before 2003. And again, the level of discipling in the ICOC in general is not the same intensity as it was, but it's still there to some degree. Especially in cases my wife and I have helped out with the last several years, it's people who are directly involved in these type of discipling relationships where the discipler is pretty much directing them to do things or don't do things, and they don't want to do those things. So, so especially since doctrinally it hasn't changed. And this is what it all comes down to: is it's the still same wrong gospel that kept codified and nailed in stone in 1987 with disciples' baptism, kind of separated themselves from the mainline churches of Christ. I know Chris and I and other people can go into the theology a little bit deeper. Maybe we should do a podcast about that. What do you think? But again, it's the same gospel, which fundamentally no one else teaches, and practically if you read it out, no one else in the world, there's no chance of anyone else being a disciple outside, at least right now, the ICOC and ICC.
Yeah, one interesting point for me is hold on a second, let me make sure that I'm sharing correctly on the first principles here. So over the last 5 months, I've been kind of going through all their study sequences. So, you're familiar with these, have been pulled in before. This is their catechetical series. So this is what gets you to the point that you will be baptized. And it's everything that you have to know. And fortunately, I yanked out all my stuff from 1992, so around the time that I was a member. And I also got copies of their study sequences of the First Principles app, as well as in the ICOC there, latest published ones. East Africa has one copy. It's very similar to the one that the Big Apple, Staten Island, New York Church of Christ did. And then I also cross-referenced the City of Angels copy. So this is recent. And so I kind of was like, okay, having a little bit of biblical criticism, where you can kind of like look across different themes. I applied some of those techniques and was like, okay, what are some similarities and differences between their study sequences? So, seeking God is not as interesting, of course. That's like, they try to get you to really be interested in spiritual things, and that you should get into Bible studies. But once you start getting into things like the main studies, the word study, the discipleship study, things like that, there is actually an enormous amount of similarity. In fact, there's probably like between the 1990s version, pre-Henry Creed letter, and the ICOC latest versions, it's like a 99% overlap, maybe a little bit more. And the latest ICOC studies is probably like 96, 97% overlap. They, I didn't count differences if they use the same pericope, but in a difference in optic, or if there were like really minor differences, like, there's like 2 verse differences between some of the studies, but the same study sequence, the same scriptures, the same illustrations, the same pictures, the same points. So to me, this says, hey, you have not substantially changed a lot.
And I know one thing that we were, Franklin's and I were talking about before we started recording is that with the studies, if you just look at the scriptures objectively, you think, okay, this is kind of a little unconventional in some places, but what's wrong with it? So you have to realize that when you do a study, it's not someone individually on their own reading these, or it's not a one-on-one, it's a group of current members studying with one person. So you have that pressure. And I know it's one of the studies that I critiqued. I actually got one with the leadership notes, and basically helps direct the leader to kind of help manipulate or move along, help the person who's being studied with kind of move along. So there's a lot of manipulation. So like during the cross study, you're doing the scriptures, and it's kind of like, oh man, your sin put Jesus on the cross, and every time he's getting whipped, it's like your sin you did on your sin list. Stuff like that. So you are definitely being manipulated with these too. So we have to keep that in mind.
Go ahead, Janice, you had something to say?
Yeah, thank you. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm kind of yelling into my old laptop speaker, but on the question of have they changed, that's why I wrote the 2019 ICOC report. It was written and published in 2019. And since the ICOC was founded, I believe in 1979, I wanted to make sure that was published on the 40-year mark. And I spent 3 years basically, I'm a retired teacher, but I spent 3 years, believe it or not, researching on the one question, have they changed, and what was the nature of that change? And I just want to say that Michael Potts has nailed it. There was no substantial theological change whatsoever, and we talked about it was kind of akin to rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic or changing up the furniture in your home. Anyone could go on to Amazon and Google that, or you can go to sparrowministry.com and get the book. I think it's a few dollars. Interviews were had with, I just got to look here because I can't remember all these people, Gordon Ferguson, Steve Stanton, Ed Anton, who's discipling a bunch of churches on the East Coast, Douglas Jacoby, John Oakes. The reason why people are returning to the ICOC is because of the nature of the teaching, which is what Michael said. It's one true church, or basically it's one true doctrine. So that's a circular argument that goes back, wait, we're not the one true church, man, that's cultic. But wait a minute, this doctrine is so specific, this disciples' baptism, the disciple doctrine, man, nobody else is teaching that, so we're the only game in town. So people are coming back to that of which they've only been told and that which they know, if they're not dropping out of Christianity altogether.
And I just want to add that, you know, and this has been mentioned before about, you go to their websites, and Michael has talked about some of the worship. You know, they really are parroting a lot of what's going on in evangelicalism and putting their own stamp on it, and they look very safe, very much like your church down the street. They've always been pretty good about presenting a certain face. I've listened to a fair number of sermons over the years, and they're not as aggressive, I guess you might say, as they've been in the past. They tend to be a little bit, I almost want to say lukewarm. But we know from experience that that's not where the discipling really happens. That's their face for the outside world. And those are the kinds of things that when we were in, it was like a big deal. I remember I was in the group for a while, then I left and I came back, and a former roommate of mine was saying, wow, we dance now. And I mean, you know, things that they were able to do that before, I mean, it was like a big deal.
We can have wine. Somebody says we can have wine.
We can have wine. You know, first of all, they didn't have the right to tell you you couldn't have wine in the first place, but see, that's what you're not catching. So I think for people, I remember when we did the open forums after Crete came out, we were up in LA Church of Christ. We were in the desert cities out in Palm Springs. And I remember in the open forum, so many people were applauding our leaders because it was a much gentler ICOC than what they were accustomed to. So the standard is so low. But the funny thing is that Joe and I as a couple, the most abusive discipleship we ever received was in that church. So it didn't matter that the leaders were a little gentler. I mean, they had people that old school people discipling. That's the problem with discipleship, with their discipleship. But I do think that they you know, for those of us that are around back in the day, it looks very, very different. And that I could see people on a superficial level saying, hey, it's people aren't going to be all in my business as much as they were, and it's okay. So I just wanted to add my 2 cents on that, what I've seen.
Perfect. Michael looks like he was about to add something.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not only in terms of discipling of the doctrine, but also kind of the big implications of those. So going down the question list here, is the dating scene still controlled? Are they not allowing unmarried members to date other Christians outside the ICOC? I say in general, yes. They're not allowing members to date non-members. There could be situations where that happens to a degree. I know that my wife and I helped someone who was interested, was getting into a relationship with a current member, and they tried to get him to come in. And it didn't happen because this guy actually knew his Bible, which was really good. And I guess there probably have been some instances where they just go ahead and let another member marry a non-member and then let them go off with that other member for some degree. But yeah, the dating and all that is still controlled. Let's see, if we're going down the list here. When I was in the ICOC the last time, I felt like I was going to lose my mind because multiple people discipling me. How could this happen? Were people trying to cause me to lose my mind or cause me great emotional distress, or was it not intentional? I don't really have a timeline for this question of when the last time was, but again, these questions are just telling me that, you know, it could have been in the 80s and the 90s or the 2000s or 2010s. That, you know, the same abuse is still going on.
Yeah, I think we had some former member socials last year, even where, you know, kind of tying the last 2 questions together. There's Sean happened to show up. He was from Los Angeles, and he started dating a young lady who he's now married to, and he's also left the church. But he was a Kingdom kid. Been in the church a very, very long time, like 25, 26 years. And he got to know this lady, and she was a very devout Christian and was in graduate school for Christian work. And when he returned back to the Los Angeles Church of Christ, everybody came out of the woodwork and started commenting about how he was in sin. Clearly he was in sin, and without even getting to know the lady. And this was very eye-opening for him. And people that he barely had a relationship with were speaking with him very directly on this topic. So this is happening pretty recently. Go, Joan and Janice.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that I think part of that could be just the whole discipleship culture where you're considered spiritual for being a busybody, being in other people's business. And some people's personalities really lend themselves to that and they're drawn to that. And there are others that really just want to mind their own business. But it doesn't take a whole lot of people to really create, some chaos and the Bible warns about that. It says in the New Testament, it talks about not being busybodies, going around other people's homes, getting in other people's business. But the ICOC has codified that, in their studies, that that's some of what they're known for is getting each other's business. And so whether even if somebody's not officially discipling somebody, they may feel like they're really helping you when they're actually creating a lot of friction and problems and possible divisions and that sort of thing. But I think some of that really is part of the culture of the group itself.
And you can't help but think too that the disciple doctrine is still based on the earthly ministry of Jesus.
Yes.
So in the ICOC, wow, all of a sudden you're one of the 12 apostles, maybe the 13th, and maybe instead of a capital A, it's a lowercase.
Yeah.
And, you have to ask yourself, where is the Holy Spirit in all of this?
Yes.
I mean, that is the true question to be asked for any legalistic group is where is the sanctifying Holy Spirit within what it is that you're doing?
You're taking the place of the Holy Spirit.
That's right.
It's not intentional, but it happens. It's the nature of the beast.
Yep.
All right. Okay, I got one more here on if things have really changed, and this one's kind of heavy. I have heard of several people in the ICOC who committed suicide. Why is that happening? And I know, at least in my time, I've learned of at least two men. They were both Kingdom kids in their 20s, and they both committed suicide since I left. And it's tragic. I know I don't remember any cases off the top of my head when I was still in, because they probably would kept it hush hush. But again, this is a sign that the system is still abusive, especially, my heart goes out to these second generation, these folks who grow up in church, and this is your only view of Christianity, especially since 2003, where here's the crazy thing. If you're about 33 years or younger, you have never, in the ICOC, you have never been under the traditional discipling system with Kip McKee. So you've got that, and you also, if you joined after 2003, you haven't either. So it tells me that, that even with Kip out of the picture, the abuse is still occurring, and sometimes it just has really devastating consequences to it.
Can I add, Michael? Yeah, I think that, again, that's the nature of discipling, because it's when we were in, it was the pyramid structure. Once that toxin kind of gets into the system, how do you get rid of it? It's there, even though there are people there that weren't back in the old days, things have been passed down to some degree, and that'll eventually take time to work out of the system if it ever does. But in terms of the suicide, I think definitely they're very guilt and shame oriented. And I remember when I was going through the old sermon, things have probably changed some in that regard. But I was really struck by the manipulation. They asked a lot of questions, very leading questions, like, how are you doing today? Are you being like Jesus today? And the implication was that no, you're in sin, you're messed up. And it's a very dysfunctional codependency where it's like they say they want you to mature and be like Christ, but then you won't need them if you become like Christ. So it's this sick dependency, and it breeds a lot of guilt. And especially right now, when you consider that health, since the pandemic, mental health issues, particularly for young people, are very much on the rise. And a group like that where you don't have any real your assurance of your salvation is very low. And if you're already vulnerable, I could see where that'd be a problem. We recently got to meet a woman down in Australia online. We met her husband. She left the church a while back. This is more in the past, but her husband attempted suicide, something like 4 times after they left the church, and
She cares for
he ended up with brain damage, and he realized that he wasn't a Christian at the time. He is now. They have a much better understanding of the gospel and grace and so forth. So, I don't know how they compare to other churches in terms of people being suicidal, but I know that the degree of PTSD, anxiety, and depression for people that have left the group has got to be higher than your average church. I can't believe. I mean, I don't have the evidence for it, but we all hear about it all the time. And it just
Justine raised her hand, so I'm going to address her. Go ahead, Justine.
I can speak as a former Kingdom kid. I attempted suicide when I was like 12, and I was in the church because I literally thought that was the rest of my life. It was the darkest. It was just so dark because I thought that was all there was. And of course, at that time, like I'm 35, so I was there during like the very, very intense period and never knew anything different because I was 3 when my parents joined. It was, my heart goes out to every single child. That's why I work so hard for this. That is literally, like, I do not sleep right now. You guys, the last 2 months, I have been on the phone with everybody under the sun to make sure that they get stopped for the children, like for anybody, but for the children, because I was one of them. And my parents were advised not to get me help. They were advised, okay, I got to go to a therapist, but it was an ICOC therapist. Well, as if I was going to trust him, right? And I went to him for like 2 years. And that was not very helpful because I didn't feel like I could be honest. And over that time period, I just got sicker and sicker. And basically, when I figured out that I couldn't kill myself because I didn't know how to do it right, I kept being hospitalized, but it wasn't working. So I ended up with an eating disorder and just decided to slowly die. And I would be like, if there's a God, please take me now. Like, I don't want to be here, because I knew they were going to plan my marriage. I knew they never talked to me about college. They talked to me about leadership. They talked to me about marrying a man in church. Nobody talked to me about who I could be, anything beyond the church. It was so dark. So that's why I do what I do. And yeah, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, bipolar 2, which is more mild, but and that I can directly relate to, being raised in that. So yeah, let's save the children, guys.
Yeah, I've seen, sadly, a lot of it is tied back to, legalism and a lot of other things. I think, Joe and Janice raised it. You'll see it in a lot of the other podcasts on the same topic. I was listening to Austin's podcast a couple of days ago. He brings it up. Guilt, shame, very, very heavy use of those in the International Church of Christ and the International Christian Churches. I think there's also a lot of phobias. I heard of people who still use the term like fall away. And what does that imply? Like, you're leaving God, right? You leave this group, you're leaving God. And that, you won't ever find anything outside. There's that phobia. You won't find any other committed group of Christians. You won't even have a life if you leave. And all those are sadly phobias that are kind of indoctrinated to members. And I would not be surprised. I'm trying to, looking through some of their sermons, I wouldn't be too surprised if they would suggest that, if you leave this church, that, you're going to hell, or, you're hell-bound, or things like that.
Yeah, there we go. All right, let's see. Looking on my list here. Well, the kids aren't from that time. All right, so kind of a lateral from that. Has the ICOC really changed since 2003? This might be helpful for International Christian Church members. What are the differences between the ICOC and ICC? So what we covered already is obviously the leadership. You've got a central leadership in the ICC with Kit McKean. You have the strict hierarchy, the pyramid. You can literally go to any ICC member and they can tell you who's discipling them and who are they discipling? ICOC, it's a little bit looser. Obviously, theology is the conversion theology is pretty much the same. Kip kind of, I think he added some other stuff to the studies to kind of help combat people from falling away to leaving too quickly, persecution study. So, but the core gospel that they preach is still basically the same. I think one of the things that the that Kip has brought up continually he says the ICOC they returned to a mainline Church of Christ theology, and I say nope, not even close, because again the mainline Churches of Christ, for your baptism to be effective, you have to know that you're being baptized for the forgiveness of sins. For the ICOC and ICC is, yes, you have to know that you're being baptized for the forgiveness of sins, but you also have to be baptized knowing consciously that you're becoming or have become or agree to become a disciple. So that's wrong. Again, church organization, you've got technically an Episcopal and Episcopacy, you've got the hierarchy over in the ICC, you've got the Presbyterianism, synods type stuff going on in the ICOC, and of course the mainline Churches of Christ, they're all fiercely independent. They're, at best you can say they network together, but they kind of work together on some stuff depending on how flavor of legalism you're dealing with here, because some of them won't even network with each other. So that's totally different. Yeah, so those are kind of the big things. So when Kip says they return to the mainline theology, it's like, yeah, don't buy that worth $1 here. Let's see.
Amy, you want to say something or ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I can relate to what Michael was saying. Obviously, by the way, my name's Ian Magbe. I joined the ICC, so that's Kip's new movement, back in 2009. And I left in 2013. And like you said, it's, I think Michelle said in her podcast, it's the ICOC pre-Hillary Clinton letter on steroids at this present moment in time. I do have a sister there that is a women's ministry leader, so obviously it's still quite raw and stuff and everything. And yeah, there's still that abusive structure. You know, we're the only ones. And like I said, the love bombing when you join, but if you dare to leave, obviously, they will say that you've got your fall away, and that's triggered. And I do know of a case of someone in Australia who did commit suicide. Or I think not Australia, but maybe Hong Kong, maybe that region anyway, did commit suicide in the ICC because he already had mental health challenges. But when you have a leader that says, if you leave this place, you might as well be dead. And obviously you have no form of reference to counter that. You're going to believe it. And I think there's a correlation. I think sometimes if your first step to Christianity was, you introduced it with the high-end, ICOC pre-Henry Pick lecture, or you joined ICC, you had no form of it and you leave, I think you're more susceptible to it. I think the reason why I still kept my faith was I kind of was a Christian before I joined. I kind of knew the Bible a bit. But, when someone comes to you and sort of, it's the group, like Michael was saying, the group dynamics, when you have a lot of people on you and just on one person, it's very hard to refute that in that present moment in time. I think they call it social proof because everyone's suggesting you're wrong, you can capitulate. But yeah, that was my experience.
Good, thanks for sharing. Let's see here. Let's see next. Let's see the other question about the differences between ICOC and ICC, kind of related to that. Do you see the possibility of both groups merging in the future? I don't think so, because either one or both groups have to adjust their discipling in order to get along. So that's kind of the big thing. So one interesting thing I wanted to tack onto this before we move on is that if you look at traditionally how the ICOC, how they built their churches, they start with Boston, start and build a mega church, as many as people as possible, and then you have you got to a certain size, you start sending off mission teams, and their teams were about the big cities, go out to their own mega church, go to big. So the focus was on growing the pillar churches, the ones that were going to be the engines for growth with these big cities would be just to grow people and then just plant churches from there. So interestingly, Andy Fleming, a couple of years ago, he came out, an ICOC guy, he came out and he actually analyzed their group's growth statistics. And they discovered that when Kip left Boston to go off a couple of years before he took over the original Los Angeles ICOC in 1989, or was it 1990? I think he left Boston in 89 and then he got Los Angeles in 90 or 91, somewhere around there. Oh yeah, because he had to plant Moscow in 1991. So let me think. Another question here emerging. So I don't see them really merging, but the thing is the current ICC, the way that Kip has constructed the ICC for growth would be to plant as many churches as possible, as quickly as possible. So in general, you have the City of Angels Church in Los Angeles. It's their hub. So it's kind of a hub and spoke model. So City of Angels is right in the middle and just planting churches across from that. So that's why we're seeing a lot of church plants coming out of the ICC. And I think one reason for that is because in most places, probably all the places that got the ICC, there's an ICOC congregation. So if there's something happens and the ICOC congregation in a certain town wants to join Kip's group, Kip's current group becomes a Reconstruction team. They can go in and take over the ICOC church there. I don't see it happening, but it's an option if something crazy happens. So
can I ask you a kind of a question that goes along with it? I just got to thinking about this. Kip is pushing 70, and he's obviously not one to share the leadership at the top too well. What do you see happening when he dies? Or becomes to a point where he just can't do what he's doing anymore?
Tim Kernan.
Aha.
Do you think he has somebody in mind to take his place, or would he even go there? I mean, it's hard to imagine him even pegging somebody to take his place, but what do you think?
Right. Well, actually, you're kind of getting onto the next question here. What is your prediction of the future of the ICOC and ICC? So we'll do the ICC first. So kind of back up from that, I wrote a paper 10 years ago called Enjoy the Silence, which kind of takes the first 10 years after the Henry Crete letter, kind of looks at where the ICOC is at that point, where there's kind of like, I think the conclusion for that is, okay, they got the gospel wrong, so there's kind of floating out there right now. I think we could probably draw some more conclusions. I know I need to get that paper completed and get it out. There's the original one. So ICOC's future. So basically, okay, they still have the gospel wrong. But the thing is, when they try to implement some type of discipling, since the gospel is wrong and you're going to have to, for something to discipling become effective, it has to be authoritarian to some degree. It has to be some control of members on top of other members for it to be effective. So that's the reason they haven't really pushed it too hard. I know that Sean Kirkland in Cincinnati, he said that, hey, they're going to go back to mandatory discipling. And since he's the shepherding couple of all the ICOC congregations in Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia, it's probably going to happen to those congregations too if things progress. But there's no way to have, because you think about it, shouldn't 20 years from now, if everything was good, shouldn't some organic discipling have naturally formed by now, 20 years later? But it hasn't. So you got that going on. And let's see here. So there's I see another dynamic going on. There's a Christian apologist, James White. He's out in Phoenix, Arizona. Really smart guy. But one of for his ministry, he started actually reaching out to Mormons. He's been doing that for over 30 years now, I think. So one thing he's seen with Mormonism is, well, first of all, they're kind of getting away from the Mormon, going over to Church of Latter-day Saints. But the thing is, if he said that if you look at when they started the ministry 30 years ago, and they go out to like big church Mormon events, you know, they wouldn't have any problem like running into people and talking with them, and they would be absolutely convinced of, you know, having Joseph Smith being their prophet, and theirs was the only way to actually get to heaven and all that other stuff. But recently, over the past 5 to 10 years or so, you're starting to run into more of the younger people who are in Mormonism, where they're just kind of like, they're there, they don't really believe it, and they're starting to kind of behave, kind of think, kind of take on some of the more attributes of, you know, kind of normal society, where it's like, you talk to an older Mormon and you're like, oh, homosexuality is wrong, but you talk to a younger one, it's like, no, I don't think so. I think the church is kind of wrong on that. And we're seeing some of those dynamics in the ICOC. And the reason we're seeing that there is that's because there's no discipling. There's nothing to kind of point everybody in the same direction. So the other thing is, again, we're not seeing this really in the ICC. At least it's not, at least it's not being shown publicly. So that's kind of the reason we're seeing like folks like the space makers, who are kind of trying to change things from the inside of the ICOC. Even though some of them have been told by leadership to kind of, hey, kind of pipe down, kind of zip it, and some of them have left. So yeah, so that's kind of where the ICOC is kind of leading right now, in my opinion. For Kip's ICC, like you pointed out, Janice, yeah, Kip is going to be, I think he's 68 this year. He's going to be 78 in another 10 years. He's also going to break the record in the next 10 years of leading one of the discipling movements. So again, if you take the time where Kip started in Boston to where he got kicked out in 2002, and then depending on where you start the clock, whether it's the beginning of 2003 or 2007, when Kip says the new movement actually started, which, okay, whatever, that he's definitely going to break his record. If he keeps going, he's going to break his record 10 years from now in 2033. And okay, that's never happened before. So I guess the other thing would be, you know, Tim Kernan has pretty much been, from what we've seen, he's been selected as a successor of Kip right now. And in fact, with some people moving around, I know the Kernans used to lead the City Angels Church, and now they've kind of moved out of that position, and they're kind of helping Kip do his kind of overseeing role of going to different churches and strengthening them. So Tim Kernan's kind of doing that right now. So it looks like he's going to be the successor. You know, I don't see him being obviously as charismatic, powerful as Kip. That also kind of leads into another question. Why we have the original Chuck Lucas back in 1967. We have Kip and him being converted in 1972. Where's the next Kip coming from? We haven't seen the next Kip. It's been, 40 years? And again, it doesn't take a lot. Like if you go back to my example, talking with James White and Mormonism, he said that, hey, there's nothing really stopping some younger, charismatic, intelligent, you know, younger member of the Latter-day Saints to say, holy cow, my church has drifted. These apostles here leading us and kind of, you know, they're not really doing their job here, you know, and not go to a level like a fundamentalist Mormon was like, okay, we're going to go out and we're going to build our little compound. I'm going to marry like 90 women or whatever, but kind of like get Mormon, like there's nothing really stopping them leading kind of a splinter group of Mormonism back to where Mormonism was practiced, you know, before maybe the 90s or the 1990s or the 1980s. So again, there's nothing really stopping anyone in either the ICOC or ICC from picking up the studies and kind of doing their own thing, or even maybe modifying it to some degree. Like, I think I also mentioned this in the paper, you know, there's nothing really stopping someone from trying to merge that with social justice type stuff, where you got to accept, you know, you have to accept some type of social justice in order to become a real disciple. And I guess the other thing would be there's nothing like there's a lot of ICOC people that are listening to a guy named Marty Solomon, and he's coming from a perspective of kind of a Jewish perspective, and his perspectives on the scriptures. And a lot of ICOC people, especially young people, like to listen to him because, you know, he's giving them the scriptures and things you don't really listen to in the ICOC. Some Jewish background, and I haven't listened to too much of his stuff. I do have some really big concerns about it. Specifically, I've heard in one podcast where he said the biggest problem with humans isn't sin, it's fear. So it's like, sin comes from fear, because fear's our key problem. It's like, no, dude, that's kind of the opposite, the other way around here. But there's nothing to say there's someone who could take some of Marty's views of Jewish inspired and kind of some Jewish perspective on the scriptures, and then merge that in with ICOC doctrine. So that may be more likely the social justice, but go ahead, Janice.
Yeah, you got me thinking about that. You know, I think that there's always going to be some kind of movement outside the mainstream. And you kind of see this in society right now, where certain people are just drawn to things that are kind of anti-establishment. And I think that the ICOC was kind of birthed out of that. Okay, we're not going to be like them. We're going to be radical. We're going to be different. So I think they're very susceptible to other cultic notions, things that set them apart, because they, like we talked about, I mean, they're for the ICOC specifically, they're not as distinctive as they once were, because the discipling is not this hierarchical, you know, mandatory thing. They've gotten soft by their own standards over the years. And so, like you talked about in your paper about the different splintering that could take place. And the thing about the Jewish perspective is interesting to me, because I've seen on, I don't remember what it was now, on ICOC Facebook pages and stuff, where every now and then you'll have someone come in and talk about Yeshua, and you got to do this and that. And so I've seen some of that emphasis. And I think it does come from that kind of thinking. And we saw societally some of that stuff that came around the pandemic, and some of the politics where there's outside, everything's a conspiracy and don't trust anyone that's mainstream. I think ICOC is kind of cut out of that mold a bit. And maybe there's members that don't want that, but there's always going to be those people that are going to be geared toward that. And it makes it difficult for them to really grasp the gospel, because oftentimes it's not the extremes, it's more in the middle, and they're just and like being in the middle ground is just anathema to these groups. They don't want to be in the middle. To me, they view that as like being lukewarm, as opposed to being orthodox. So I kind of see that as an issue.
Eric R has raised his hand. Go for it, Eric.
Yeah, hey, I hope everyone's doing good. Guess to introduce myself here, and I'll follow up with a question here. I was around in the ICOC from 2000 to 2006, so at the tail end of the Kip McKean discipling movement to, I guess, about 3 years after the Henry Crete letter. So didn't really see much of a change from that. I think, between when Kip resigned, which I was actually in the Long Beach Convention Center when he announced his sabbatical. And I think Justine was probably there too, probably closer than I was. So yeah. And the only change that I really saw after the Henry Crete letter was that they started introducing instruments in their singing. I remember being a cappella, and I didn't really think much of it. And then when they started bringing in instruments, it kind of gave more of a mainstream Christianity sort of feel, which personally I didn't have a problem with, but there were obviously there were other issues with the church itself that caused me to leave, and I think everyone else here too. So I guess I'm kind of going into my question here. With this lawsuit looming, and I guess whatever the outcome ends up being, do you think that one, it's going to affect the bottom line, and two, if it doesn't put the ICOC or the ICC out, do you think they will kind of exist kind of like the way that the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints or the Jehovah's Witness, where they're just kind of off in a corner, you know, people know that they're there, but nobody really goes to their meetings or services except for like a select few?
That's a really great question. And, you know, it's hard to predict the future. I think there's definitely people like Shell, and I think Justine's also probably in a similar situation where they're very optimistic that the lawsuit will wake up a lot of people. And I think the ICOC and ICC, their reputations will be tarnished. And that, you know, certainly this is going to be a major turning point. You know, I don't know. I would prefer, you know, personally, if you asked me, I would prefer them to repent and to come clean, to, you know, come to the authorities, expose themselves and, you know, show everything that happened, and not only cooperate, but be, you know, very sincere and zealous about prosecuting those who they protected. And, you know, that would show some degree of repentance to me. Unfortunately, that will also lead to their undoing. But they've kind of had this long-standing, you know, PR campaign of trying to show you that they're the perfect church, when clearly this is not the case. And that's kind of part of what image that they're trying to maintain. And they've overpromised on a lot, obviously, including this perfect church image. And now a lot of things are being exposed, being brought to light, including cover-up of not only, you know, the people who have come forward already in terms of the unreported sexual crimes of minors, but it's going to be a significant number and very problematic. It's not just, you know, one or two cities or cases, or it's not isolated incidents. It's pretty widespread, and so it's going to be pretty problematic. Yes, Justine.
There are so many cases coming out, and it's not. There's definitely more minor cases coming out, as well as adult. And one of the things with this is, like, you know, it's weird that this is what this was like finally what we were able to get in for, but you know, we knew we really wanted to get in there for the finances, because everybody has known that they have been manipulating the finances. But the way that we were able to get there was, unfortunately, by uncovering all of the sex abuse. And there's a ton of it, which is totally disgusting, but that has actually led us to the finances. So if people aren't disgusted enough by the sex stuff, let's hope that they care enough about their money that they're going to be like, whoa, hold on a second. I sold my TV and I've been eating ramen, and you've been, you know, using all of this money to live in these great places and have these nice cars and all of those things. So I know I am optimistic, because I mean, I'm on this end too, where I'm like the one who's hearing all of this. And I'm like, how on earth could anybody survive this? But I have noticed, I am friends with some people in the ICOC and one friend in the ICC, and all of them are kind of doing the same thing, kind of like blaming the other, like, oh no, that was a long time ago and all of that. They're not going to be able to keep doing that when we roll out the next set. I don't think they're going to be able to do that. So my hope is that people realize that this is not the one true church, and that they find, you know, a safe place to be, and recognize that they aren't safe now. They feel safe because they are being controlled, and people want to be subconsciously want to be controlled. They want to be told what to do because it makes them feel good, and it makes them feel like somebody cares. But one wonderful thing that all of us can do is be there, like we have been, as people are leaving, and we can be like, hey, we're safe and we hear you and we support you. And I think that's going to make the biggest difference, because they're all going to lose everybody that they love all at the same time if they leave.
Exactly. One other thing in terms of finances. So obviously externally don't really have a good picture of it, but in general, we could probably make some general observations. So probably the ICC is more likely financially vulnerable because, number one, their size. Number two, it looks like they're spending a lot of resources in planning churches. And of course, that takes money to do. I guess the third thing with that would be, I think a couple of years ago, Chris, there was a guy who left, and he claimed in terms of the ICC finances that they're basically maxing out credit cards. So that tells me that they could be running closer to a really shoestring budget. So if something financially did happen, that they would be a lot more vulnerable than the ICOC. Of course, I probably sue both groups for $1 trillion and put them out of business tomorrow, but it's probably not going to happen. But again, if these lawsuits, more of the lawsuits will come out, and then the financials are exposed, and we're probably going to get a better picture of what that looks like. But it's probably going to take a lot of time to get there. All right, let's see. Let's move on here. Okay. So these questions are kind of like I put on the category, what happened? So people have been asking questions, what happened here, what happened there? Okay, first, can you summarize what happened with the ICOC in Indianapolis, Madrid, Libsyn, and Milan? Something tell me the events will help me understand current events in the ICC, specifically with the Rones, because I was not in the ICOC. Okay, so kind of some background. Recently, I think last month, Colton and Mandy Roan, International Christian Church leaders of their church in Columbus, Ohio, they left, and they were marked primarily because they came to the conviction that the church should not be coercing people to give money. So they have left, and they got marked. So the difference between that and what happened in Indianapolis, because Indianapolis was a seminal event, and that happened in 1994, where you had their leader back then, Ed Powers, who I think he was on a skiing trip, and then he hurt his leg, and he was kind of laid up in bed for a while, and he has the time to think about stuff. So this was a time where Kim was in Los Angeles, he was tightening controls, and he was telling other churches, hey, Los Angeles needs these resources. We need money. We need people to kind of move out here to help build up the ministry, things like that. So Ed came to the conviction of, hey, Indianapolis, we're not we're big, we're not the biggest church out there. And I don't see any reason why we should take our people and our resources. So he was focused on kind of, standing up to Kip and saying, no, we're not going to do this, and here are our reasons. So He did that, and it was, it did not go over very well. So it ended up as the most people went off under Ed Powers and his leadership to form what's now known as Circle City Church in Indianapolis. And then Kip came in, he took a smaller group that didn't go, and he reformed the Indianapolis ICOC. So the biggest, I'm a little bit more hazy about Madrid and Milan, but basically I think the biggest difference between what happened in Columbus recently and what happened in Indianapolis was Ed Powers had his leadership team on board with him. I don't think anyone on Ed Powers' team dissented. Well, in the Columbus situation, it was just Colton and Mandy, and the rest of his leadership was not going along with him. So that's not to say that sometime in the future there could be another Ed Powers type of split where the key is you got to get your leadership on board, and they weren't in Columbus. Unfortunately for them, but fortunately for the Rones, because they left.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising. Like for me, it's, there's these events are about 28 and a bit years apart. So, we can call it 3 decades. And Ed Powers brought up four major points. One was there shouldn't be central control, meaning policy and doctrine shouldn't be legislated from Los Angeles. Second point was, he didn't believe that the International Church of Christ was the only group that had people who were saved. We're not the only Christians. The third point was giving should not be under compulsion, very similar to Colton Roan's point, right? Can't extort, completely flies in the face of 2 Corinthians 9:7. That says people, individuals need to be convinced by the Holy Spirit, like, hey, this is what I want to give, and I've prayerfully considered it, and this is what I feel good about. And it's not always just to like a church or whatever. It could be whatever causes that you deem fit. It could be to different staff workers or different situations. But it shouldn't never be extorted or under compulsion. And then also talking about legalism. So that was his fourth point. Legalistic practices in the system was robbing the Christians of their joy, like the emphasis on quotas and statistics, and they had to meet special contribution goals. So that's kind of, those are the similarities. And as Michael said, that the big differences. So Ed Powers kind of figured this out on his own, and then went to his core group and said, hey, I will offer to resign if you disagree with us. And this is what I've come to my conclusions. They studied it out. They said, yes, we are in agreement. And then they approached all of the staff members, I think it was like total 26 people, including the interns, and said, we, the three couples who are like, the evangelists and the elders have studied this out, and we're okay, we'll all resign. If you disagree with us on this, you can perfectly align yourself to Los Angeles and to the International Church of Christ. And we'll, we don't want to like force your hand on this, but this is what we've come to figure out. And they all were in agreement. So then Ed Powers kind of preached this in front of about 1,000 people. I think it was like 993 or 992, but 1,000 people. And, so pretty much that was a major, point, a major event in church history that even Kip refers to as like Sodom and Gomorrah, that they left. He sees, he's rewritten the narrative on his side as, this is a bunch of hard-hearted and bitter people who are, trying to mislead people. But the topics and even like a number of the things that Colton has brought up are very similar. So, sadly, it's a little bit of history repeating itself. I do know about, so Lisbon and Madrid there's a lead evangelist named David Medrano, and he kind of studied a lot of like what the church was about and their practices. You can find the resignation letter on Reveal, but again, very similar situation in terms of like, the lights went off, realized a lot of the problems, and decided to leave and write about it. There's actually a whole series of churches. I was reviewing it this morning. It's like Nairobi and Milan and numerous others that they've had these incidents, and even elders who have dissented, and it seems like a lot of times they just get silenced or shut down, or no publicity whatsoever.
All right. Very good. All right. Let's see. Let's go to this one real quick. Do you know about the events of Atlanta and Tampa around 1987 to 1988? I know some, but not everything. Okay, so this is during the kind of ICOC kind of Reconstruction era. So you have to remember that in you had the original Crossroads Church and the campus ministries, and they sent their campus ministries into mainline churches of Christ all over the United States. And some of them actually formed their own kind of crossroad flavored churches. So there was one in Atlanta, one in Tampa. So basically when Chuck Lucas, he was kicked out in 1986 for improper sexual behavior. You had all these kind of crossroads based churches that were kind of floundering and kind of like, okay, what are we doing now? So that's when the Boston movement came in and started to do Reconstruction. So you've got several churches like that: Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Atlanta, Tampa. The first well-known one was Kingston, Jamaica. So basically, just I think part of it is if the church decided to remain independent and align with Boston or not. I know that there was one in Huntsville, Alabama, and they decided, it was like, we don't want the Boston movement. We're out of here. We're getting rid of discipling altogether. But then you have some other ones that kind of went in on it. Tampa was one. Atlanta, the original Reconstruction team was led by Sam Lang, and he's the guy who converted Kip McKean. So they went down, and I think they had problems, and they had to reconstruct Atlanta again because it didn't happen. They had some issues the first time around. And there was the original Atlanta church, which, I think some people might be surprised that it was one church in the whole entire metro area up until like 2003 when they went into separate regions because Atlanta is slightly sprawled out all over the place. So that kind of makes sense. So that's kind of the overview with that. I don't think we've seen definitely not any ICOC reconstructions. Maybe there's probably some ICC reconstructions overseas with Blaise Fuemba. I know he's converted a lot of mainline Church of Christ ministers. So there's kind of been technical reconstructions of some of that to some degree.
Yeah, there were some churches that split. I think some of the ICC tried to win over the ICOC churches.
Yeah. So yes.
History on that. The reconstructions were dubbed as hostile takeovers by some writers. So in my research, I'd come across some of that information. I think in San Diego, I know in San Diego and elsewhere, when they would come in there, they would basically declare everyone not saved. So at that point, you'd lost your salvation. So we're talking about the doctrine of falling away. And by the afternoon, if you made the right confessions and the right professions, you would have gained your salvation back. So yo-yo Christianity. But in San Diego, they had a list of, I think, 5 questions, and then
I can share about that.
Yeah, Janice.
Yeah, let me share about that because I actually went through the Reconstruction in San Diego, and they had a certain script, I think, that they pretty much followed all this. So I'm sure that my experience was not unusual. But I remember it. We all had to get together, and they did this big rah-rah sermon. I don't remember the specifics, but I remember there was some confessing afterward where people got in a circle, and they would different confessions. And then each of us had to have a meeting, one with like a ministry leader and then another under leader. And I remember, talking with them, and they just kind of ripped into me, tell me what a horrible disciple I was, all this stuff, and I need to repent. And they told me to get my Bible out, that I wasn't to eat or sleep until I was broken. So I remember I was in college, and I got down on my knees at night, opened up my Bible, and then I'd wake up in the morning in the same position. I would 4 days I went like that. Then they apologized, said, I didn't think it would take that long. So then they decided I need to write down every sin I'd ever committed in thought, word, deed, and get together with my roommate, who was also my Bible type leader, and confess all these sins to her. And bottom line, I never placed membership. I never was rebaptized. But Joe's right. I mean, I was allowed for a time to continue living with my roommates, but I couldn't date. And it was just an unspoken that, hey, I'm not really part of the group anymore, but I still am going. And yeah, they would have a list people would come forward and ask for prayers and have lists of people that, this person got baptized, these people were restored. And it was a really difficult experience. A lot of shame, a lot of, it was just a lot of pressure. And I wanted to share that because I actually did go through that. And I don't know how many people like me did make it, because I absolutely believed in what they were selling at the time. And so when I left, I ended up becoming agoraphobic. I mean, I was having anxiety attacks 4 years later, not right away. Right away, I was just tired. Like I felt like I had the flu all the time. I wasn't doing well in school. And then I kind of settled in a little bit. Then 4 years later, I started having anxiety attacks. It was because I thought I'd lost my salvation. I literally felt like I don't have what it takes to be a disciple. And that's what the Reconstructions taught you. if you made the grade, woohoo, I'm a disciple, and people were all fired up and excited in a way that they hadn't been previously. The emotional enthusiasm was higher than it had been in the past. But for people like myself, that it's like, hey, I want to be a Christian, but I'm not quite, I think a lot of it was I was protecting myself. It's like, I don't want to share every detail of my life with these people. And so, yeah, I mean, it haunted me for quite a while until I finally did come back. But yeah, it was abusive for sure.
Yeah. So thanks for sharing about that. Yeah. So that's what could happen if we have another Reconstruction here sometime, maybe. I know it's a possibility, but that's pretty much what happens. Okay, one more. What happened with? Okay, so what happened recently in October 22 with the Portland ICOC? Why aren't they part of the ICOC anymore? Okay, so Portland's led by Steve and Lisa Johnson. And Steve and Lisa Johnson have started to teach something called mutuality, which in general evangelicalism is more known as egalitarianism. So basically, it's describing the roles of men and women in the church, what they can do and what they can't do, specifically more with the women. So egalitarianism is a position that men and women are pretty much interchangeable. So you can have women actually take over, be an elder, pastor, preach to a mixed crowd of men and women. So there's no difference. Complementarianism says God pretty much says, hey, the men do these specific things, and men can only be pastors and have that role to preach and teach at the church level, at the top level. But women, you have these other roles too that you can do. So basically, they were teaching this. You have a lot of people in the ICOC, according to Lisa Johnson, when they kind of responded to this, saying that, hey, we've got larger regions, some of the larger churches, you've got probably down in Los Angeles. You've got a lot of people up in Seattle, and all the people around the world are kind of supporting this. So basically, you had the ICOC, the service committee with the elders, the graph that the chart that Chris showed a little bit earlier in our presentation here, where they basically voted, and all of them at once said, okay, our position for this is going to be complementarianism. And so since we keep telling Portland to stop it with this mutuality thing, then we're just going to take you off the list. That doesn't mean you're lost. That doesn't mean you just lost, you're unsaved. It just means that you cannot participate. You can associate to some degree, but you can't be called an ICOC church. So they replanted an ICOC church in Portland. I think they call it the Bridge Church, that actually teaches complementarianism. So the ICOC didn't even really have an official position on this until a couple months ago, technically. And again, I think part of that is, you have complementarianism as kind of the default position. And again, you don't have all this discipling going on to keep everybody on the same page. So you have egalitarianism kind of getting in there, and people being influenced by it. And the ICOC is like, no, we're not gonna deal with this. Kind of a side note, it's kind of interesting because you could argue ICOC is kind of egalitarian in a couple of areas already. Like you could have, there's still kind of divides on whether women can actually lead communion, because I've seen that before. Women can lead prayers in the church, even if they're doing it with their husband. So some streams of complementarianism would say you can't do that, but ICOC is totally fine with that. And I guess right now they're just not fine with the women actually teaching and preaching to men in the mixed crowd on Sundays. So yeah, that's what's going on in Portland. So they're kind of they can participate with their teen camps, I think, from what I heard from the presentation. They can date other ICOC members in good standing. There probably would have to be, if someone from the main ICOC came over to Portland, they would have to understand, their teaching. When someone from Portland went to the main ICOC, we have to understand that, yeah, you have to go to a complementarian position. So that's been an interesting development.
Eric, did you have a comment, or was that just you put your hand down?
Oh, I had something to say, but it was I just didn't want to interrupt anybody, so I put my hand down. But I guess kind of going off of I believe what Janice was saying about the whole like Reconstruction thing, and and the level of abuse that just basically runs rampant. I think a lot of that with definitely goes unchecked, and it kind of get into I think a lot of the word sharp has been thrown around a lot. And I know in college that usually means someone that does well in their doing well in school, or they look like they're dressed well, and they may come from money. But I know so the ICOC I was a part of, I was in Los Angeles, in particular Orange County. And I joined as a 14-year-old, and the sharp didn't always mean, you came from money, or you were good looking, or anything like that. A lot of us, including myself, we came from broken homes, where, there was a dysfunction, where there was a level of dysfunction within, family or friends, and you're trying to look for a way out. And then when you come to a place, like this church, where they're love bombing you and they're singing, you see people from all walks of life, you're naturally drawn in. So then as you get further along and you become baptized, I've seen this for myself, and I've seen this to, happen to a lot of my friends, where, that level of, discipling, or, that level of abuse, like we're just like, oh, we just, we would just take with a grain of salt, because it's really better than the alternative that, that's out there. What's out there in our environment, we're gangs, or drugs, or people who didn't care about you, whether you lived or died. And so I think for a lot of us, that's why some of us stuck around for as long as we did. I think the breaking point was for me was when I got into campus, and I think they talk about the world, how it's this bad place, but it's actually what helped me got out, because I started making friends outside of church, and they started to invite me to their functions, whereas others in the ICOC, they didn't really care, because I wasn't sharing my faith consistently, or I may have skipped out on a midweek because I had a test to study for, or I was in athletics, so I may have had a track meet the following day, and I needed to get some sleep or something. So
I want to add, one of the things we haven't talked about is the way they use relationships to manipulate people, and how the abuse we always it's easy to kind of think of like being in your face and being really hard line and stuff, but it isn't always that. I know that I talked earlier about a couple that discipled Joe and I that were pretty abusive, and the husband, he was suffering from cancer and was very soft spoken, but the things he would say, like, oh, you can't chase away a true disciple. I mean, just some of these things that would come out of his mouth. And he actually did have a background of having been abused before he was in the church. So that probably felt very normal to him. But they use relationships. When we came back to San Diego in, was it 2000, about 2015, we came back. And current ICOC member invited us to a going away party that she was having down to the park. So we went, and we saw a bunch of people we hadn't seen in years. And people gave us hugs and we talked. But I remember one of the women there, who I never knew very well, was trying to get me to come to church and said, yeah, come to church. We live close to you. And I mean, it was just kind of the implication was that, well, we could hang out if you went to church. It's very conditional. I mean, I saw right through that. It was pretty blatant. But we did, both of us went to a Bible study. Joe went to one and by himself, and then we went together to a second one and John Oakes was having when he was still living in San Diego. And the one that Joe went to that I didn't go to, there was a woman there that you maybe you'd be able to share about how she'd been baptized and what had happened to her in terms of her relationships. He may not remember, but he told me that, you know, she had been recently baptized and she said, it was wonderful when I was studying and people would invite me to go hang out and do this and that and that. And then, but once I've been baptized, it's like, you know, kind of like the people have disappeared and nobody's, and you know, there's nobody's around anymore. And what John said was like, well, you know what the answer to that is? Oh, initiate, you got to initiate. And it's like, okay, but you're not seeing the bigger picture here. The fact that they used her and took advantage of her to get her baptized. And then when she's baptized, oh, well, they're busy chasing after the next, recruit. And for some people who have a hard time making friends, that's really hurtful. You know, for people that make friends easily, they tend to do well in that group because it's like, you know, everybody's super social. But for some people, it's like a really big deal. Man, this person wants to be my friend. And I know I did the same thing when I was in it. It's one of my biggest regrets. You know, I wasn't real good at it, fortunately, but so there is that emotional manipulation of relationships where you give or withhold your friendship based on that. And it's this woman who, you know, was trying to manipulate me at the park. I don't even think she had any clue what she was doing. And that's part of the discipling. And you've been taught that. And people were I remember talking to people there at that park and mind you, this was like 6 years ago. It wasn't that long ago, 6 or 7 years ago. And when they found out, that we had family in San Diego, there was just, I could see the disappointment on their faces. It was like, oh. And it was just, it's like people were super friendly and didn't treat us weird, but there was
motive.
There was something behind there. You could feel it. And it's the indoctrination, the manipulation. And that's where a lot of the abuses come from. I know that's what led me to leave, was when I really saw that people weren't there when I needed them.
I'm going to go through some more questions, and then actually I do want to, since we're a relatively small group as well, leave some time for general questions. So we'll try to get through that.
Yeah, I think the only two major ones we haven't covered are questions involving how do I help someone leave the ICOC, ICC, and the others group would be advice for folks like us, the advocates and activists, you know. That's kind of the two major categories that are left.
Or are either of those interesting, first of all? And if not, we can certainly take questions from the field.
Well, how do we help somebody leave? My first book that I wrote, Poison Fruit, and if you go on to sparrowministry.com, you can find it, or amazon.com, and just type in Joe Franklin. It's actually a complete book that takes you through the progressive revelation and how the ICOC stumbled upon their 6 steps of salvation, not 5. They added 1 to the Church of Christ and came up with disciples, repentance, disciples, baptism. And long story short, there's a self-help section in there that has some of the, I think, Keith Stump thought reform statements. And I've also got a pictorial representation of what the manipulation in the ICOC looks like.
Carol?
From Carol Giambalvo, who's no longer with the International Cultic Studies Association.
And passed away.
The whole book is geared towards, answering how do I help somebody leave? And it's so simple. Everyone seems to love it. I loved writing it, and I will just recommend that to anyone.
Well, going on with that, I just want to say that a lot of it, obviously, it depends if somebody wants to leave. Now, if you're wanting to leave, one of the best things you can do, and Dave Anderson did a wonderful job when he did his analysis of first principles, that it's still pretty relevant because the studies haven't changed much, is to understand the manipulation. That's one thing Carol would always talk about, the psychosocial, but you also need to understand the theological. Understand how they departed from Orthodox Christianity. Once you understand what the gospel is meant to be what it really is, not what they said it was. And when you understand the psychosocial, you understand the manipulation, how the thought reform was used. Those things can help people to be set free from, but also you have a clearer mind, you know what you're dealing with. It's the confusion that you leave with that makes it so difficult. And the fear, I'm gonna lose my salvation. I think what was powerful for us when we left was knowing and growing to know what the gospel really was and saying, we don't need them. I mean, I honestly, until this, I don't even think about the ICOC much anymore. The lawsuits brought it back to me more. Obviously, I've been out for a while, and it took a lot of years to even get to this point, and they still have triggers, but gain knowledge is what I would say. Definitely gain knowledge and talk to people who have been through it. We've talked to some parents before who try to get their kids out, and we say you want to be very careful to not push them away, especially the ICOC, since they're more hardcore. ICC is more hardcore, and you have to be patient, and I think it's helpful to try to find out what is it about the group that attracts them. Like, try to look at the positive side of psychology. What is it that you're so excited about with this group? If they're recent, because a lot of people, like we were talking to a woman who lives in China, whose daughter near Hong Kong, whose daughter is in the ICC in Hong Kong and is being groomed for leadership, I believe. And we advised her on some of this because she's a strong Christian, and she's just like, what is going on with her? She was actually studied studied logic, and it's like, what's she doing? And I would tell her the same thing I'm saying now is there's something that attracted them. They're meeting a need, and if you can figure that out and listen and have a safe environment where they feel safe to be able to share with you. But if they feel like you're on the attack, then they won't hear you.
Clarissa's been waiting patiently. Clarissa, go for it.
Hey, can you hear me?
No.
All right. I belong both to the ICOC and the ICC, and I became a disciple back in around 1994, I believe. And it was after a very traumatic experience. My mom died tragically. So I became a disciple, and I was postpartum because I was pregnant when my mom died. And so I was going through a whole lot. And for me, it was a dysfunctional family that was familiar. And I think we find very familiar things. And I won't go into my story because I think I've shared it with all of you. It's great to see all of you because I feel like I know you. And I've shared a lot of my stories, a lot of my experiences online. But I just want to say that, I was disfellowshipped by both the ICOC and ICC for various reasons, and I have shared my stories. And I am really, the first time I was really scared because I was a younger mom, and my marriage was very vulnerable at the time. But I got married before I was a disciple, so I've been married for 35 years. And this is the happiest time of my life. Last year was a great year for my family. And I'm really looking for healing. And I think I appreciate these forums because it's allowed me to share my story. It's allowed me to share my experiences. And I'm moving forward. My husband and I go to a different church. We're very involved. We belong to a group where there's a lot of veterans. My husband's a veteran. And it's just been really healthy for us. We've learned how to have a healthy family system. So in many ways, the ICOC and the ICC, they taught us how not to be. So those are very healthy things to learn. And so now I've been healing. And I think what part of the problem with the ICC is there's been a lot of people coming from the ICOC, and they've brought a lot of those patterns of behavior that are very unhealthy from the ICOC. And because they like familiar, they continue with those same patterns. There's a lot of scapegoating. There's a lot of heroes. These are the heroes and these are the scapegoats. And it's amazing because I went from the scapegoat in the ICOC to the hero in the ICC because I had I had established a level of professionalism and success. And it was so heartbreaking because I saw myself in many young disciples that were struggling in the ICC, and it broke my heart that they were scapegoated. So it was just the same kind of dynamics. I'm a professional counselor, and I think there was a lot of concern I had with the mental health of the church. And of course, it's something that I think needs to be addressed. And mental health is in a crisis right now. We're in a crisis situation post-pandemic. And I think, unfortunately, I spoke to Kip McKeon about this issue, and I'm going to send some of the correspondences that I've had with some of the leaders to the attorney. But he says he doesn't know anything about mental health. And I was really surprised to hear that recently that his daughter suffered from depression and suicide ideologies, which is part of the reason he was asked to leave the ICOC. And I don't know, if my daughters were struggling with those kinds of things, I would become very knowledgeable. I would educate myself. And if you're leading a whole church and you don't know anything about mental health and your own child has those issues, you should not be leading a church with people who have mental health issues. And that's my biggest concern with any church and any organization. Let's help people not only with if we're going to talk about their physical health, how we look, and our physical stuff, we also need, and our spiritual stuff, we also need to talk about our mental health and support our members. And that's not what we're doing. We're in the churches. And I'm so glad to be out of those two churches that were very toxic for me. And I'm so glad that God has led me to a new church and a new life, and has led me away from a very destructive church, because it was destroying my life. And my children are healing from it. So, but I'm so glad to meet all of you guys. I have been so excited to see you, to see you online, and really appreciate you guys being involved. And I hope this continues to grow.
Absolutely. I think, this is, what we're hoping for is it's going to be continuing conversations, and this is, our first, but hopefully we'll continue to have others, other, formats, whether it's the socials or the Ask Me Anythings. And then certainly Michael and I have been talking about a podcast as well, in terms of, and a number of our, planned topics are over the issue of, psychology and mental health related things, ranging from, trust and boundaries and safe people and phobias. And there's a lot of topics to cover that are worth covering. And hopefully we'll be able to bring in some different professionals to talk about some of these things. We might ask Amanda, by the way, Michael,
my wife,
who's got a degree in pastoral counseling. So she was already talking. So one of my articles was talking about grief and grieving. And I stole the graphic of like the Kubler-Ross grief model, and Amanda gave some input as well about it.
Yeah, and in that whole thing, remember, we were a family in the ICOC and in the ICC. We were a family, and it hurts to lose our families. We do go through grief. It hurt. So I think it's not that we were hoping things would have been different, and we were hoping that there would have been more equity, and there just wasn't. It was a very dysfunctional and toxic place to be. And I think why some of us still grieve is because that was our family. We grew up with them. We learned from them. And it's unfortunate that we learned some very toxic traits.
Very good. We've got about 6 minutes left. Any other questions that you have or things that you'd like to bring up or talk about? Justine, you're on.
If you guys are like scrolling through any of the Facebook groups or happen to be talking to somebody and you see somebody comment something that you think maybe could be useful, please tag me. Right now, Shell is inundated, so I'm kind of just taking over and sending things over. But seriously, if somebody says anything like, well, I know I saw this or I heard this story, I will literally go down the rabbit hole with any story at this point to see if it's something that's useful. So please, 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 just tag me or send a message to me, however it is. We're like, we hit the ground running and we're not stopping. So please do that.
And thank you for your time.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
It's been
yeah, what you and Shell are doing is just completely amazing, and we're praying for you guys and see what happens.
Yeah, so Shell and Justine are pretty much like neck and neck with the they're keeping up with the attorneys. That's Bobby Samini and others. And I'm sure, you know, I personally have tried to stay out of all the stories. Like Michael and I talked with maybe 2 former members in Dallas Fort Worth over the last year who told us about rapes, and then I've known of like maybe 2 other situations, but I try to keep away from knowing all the stories, and I don't need to know all the details or all the situations, you know. But you guys are right in the thick of things, and you're talking with all the victims. And I know Shell and you both admitted that it's like you just broke down and burst into tears and cried many, many, many times for these people to realize the level of hurt that they've been experiencing. So, you know, our hearts and prayers certainly go to you.
Yeah. Justine, one other thing that we talked about was especially since it appears it'll be likely there'll be more lawsuits with more claims with affecting more cities. If it was possible to have some type of authoritative website where we could just point people to say, okay, here's all the latest information that would be kind of vetted and approved by the legal team.
I think that
because I know that some stuff is starting to get out of spin control already. Because I know that one day, I think Wednesday of last week, Shell said that she took 23 new reports in one day, and then someone from, I think the ICC said, oh, there were 23 new lawsuits. It's like, no, that's not where the 23 comes from. And, you know, Chris and I, because, you know, Chris and I, we're both engineers and we're both want to be precise, and we just want to be as accurate as possible, especially when we're dealing with this, and just kind of stop when I have just the facts, especially within the legal realm, because we don't want to get in any trouble either. So
at this point, what's okay to say is only what has been in the case files. So if it's in the case file, it's okay to say that. So like what Shell did there was actually strategic, though. She did that to see about anybody who might say something, because we have been curious about, you know, the people who are current members. I know that not all current members are being sneaky, but like there definitely have been enough of them, as we've all seen. And she did that very strategically because she wanted to see how quickly is anything I say going to go somewhere, which is why, you know, some people are kind of going into different groups to have the more private conversations, because we don't want to look totalitarian either, right? Like in our groups, we don't want to be like, you're not allowed, because that would just sound like them. However, when people are being abusive, when they are clearly not there for good reasons, then those people should go. I do think that there's been talk about like a 1-800 number, but I like the idea of a website that's just like telling what the actual facts are. What I'll do is when I have my next meeting with Shell is bring that up and say, hey, is there a way that we can do that? And then that way we're giving updates to people and we know that it's true and that it's legal to say, so we're not under, because otherwise we have like potential slander charges and things like that.
Exactly. So that anybody can just say, hey, I don't know what's going on, but here's the website, here's the case, here's what's going on.
Yeah. And so, I actually don't think that it would be a problem for anybody just to, as long as we know that everything that is there is on also in the case files, etc. I don't think that's a problem. Like I know somebody was concerned, Carl, he like restarted his ex-disciple website, and then he was concerned that maybe he shouldn't be posting about like the website and things, or not the website, the case file and things like that. But actually Shell and I talked about it and we were like, no. As long as it's in the case file, it's okay to say. Any of us can say it. I mean, if any of you are friends with me on social media, you know that I am screaming this from the rooftops. I'm just being careful to say what's on the case files and say what I know from my own experience. so that I'm not liable.
Right,
So
and just to kind of keep the like hearsay. That's also another thing that would be helpful to kind of keep all the hearsay stories. That's kind of, well, I heard this happened with this leader and this person. Just kind of keep a lid on that.
yeah, but
especially now. But exactly,
investigate that.
Watch your inbox or chat or whatever.
Yeah, no,
Some
I am.
stuff I could like have given to Shell that I'd probably give over to you. So
yeah,
just information, interesting tidbits of information, you know.
We'll take it all. We're taking everything and we're trying to figure out where it can fit and how it can fit. Because some stories, you know, maybe we're not going to be using as like part of the like something we're suing for, but we can prove the culture by some of these stories. So it is actually, all of these things are important, and we're just keeping it all and filing it all and figuring out how it can be used. As long as we can at least prove that, you know, things are true. A lot of things, you know, we're hearing are, some of them, you know, seem really outrageous. So those are some things we're like, okay, we're going to have to definitely make sure that we're getting a little more proof on this. But a lot of things we find, that's not the only one who's heard that story. Like, it's definitely, people gossiped because they were supposed to. I think that's something, I think Jan had said that, like, we were like trained to gossip. We were trained to get into people's business and then like tell our discipler, and then we looked better. So like, that is, all these stories have been trickling around for a really long time. It's just, what is it that we believe?
Hey, Justine, I was going to throw something out there a while back, and Michael and Chris know about this. A guy named Jack Pelham sued the ICOC because I guess, you know, he'd given tens of thousands of dollars to the group, and it literally was bankrupt and eating ramen noodles for like umpteen years. And I'm not sure if he ever got to the discovery phase of his life.
He didn't.
But he was hoping stuff would come through on the discovery phase.
Yeah.
Okay, so one issue we have with the money, this is why we really need to prove that the money is being mismanaged and all of the ways that it is. And we do have proof of some of it, which I can't talk about yet. Because technically, if we gave money, assuming it's just a church, not a cult and all of those things, if we gave money, then we can't use that. However, coercion is something we can use. So there's like all of these little details to figure it out. But if you want to get me in contact with him, I don't know, has he talked to Shell? Does anybody know?
Jack or Shell?
No, has Jack talked to Shell?
No, I can put Jack in touch with Shell though.
Okay, or in touch with me, and I can.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll put you guys together.
Sounds good.
Great. Last question. Eric, you get the honor.
All right. I guess the question to everyone here is: anybody surprised on how they're responding to this? I've read some of these responses that some of these churches have put out, and I'm just, it's actually disgusting that some of the ways that they're responding is, it's almost like they should say, and if they were to say exactly this will probably make their lawyers work overtime. They should just come out and just say that, you know, these people are lying and we're the truth and blah blah blah. But I just feel like the responses have been just very egregious and very manipulative. And just being on the outside, I have I could read between the lines. So.
Well, I can answer that really quickly to say that, look, I'm not surprised with the gaslighting. You see it on the news all the time, right?
Yeah.
And when I interviewed Gordon Ferguson, who is the top spokesperson for the International Church of Christ over its entire history, former elder of the Boston Church, Boston movement. And I talked to him about all the abuse and stuff like that after you know what hit the fan in 2003. He basically blamed overzealous disciples for being the problem. We have the emails. I got his permission to use what he said because he couldn't back down because he's right. Yeah. And it's in my books. I mean, these guys are completely just it's like a foil. Everything bounces off of them and goes right back to you. You know, I'm rubber, you're glue. Isn't there a song about that?
I don't know.
They are absolutely clueless. They don't care. They gaslight. They blame. They do whatever and say whatever they have to say.
They're pragmatists.
Yeah. It's Machiavellian. The ends justify the means. Like everyone has said, they have to protect the one true church because this is God's church.
Yeah.
And God's church can't have sin in it. No way.
Yeah.
That's got to be the individual. It's never the corporation. It's always the individual.
And that's one of the things that Keith Stump brought up was that's one of the cultic things. The church, that's one thing that Keith Stump brought up is that in the ICOC, the church is never guilty of sin. Only the individual is guilty of sin. And that's why these systemic abuses continue, is because they won't address the culture.
All right, well, it's a few minutes over 5 in my time. Thank you all for attending, and I'll post this, and we'll go from there. Thank you all very much for all your contributions and your questions, for answering them, for your participation and attendance, and hope to see you again sometime. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks for hosting, Chris.
Thanks, guys.